And tonight, not only am I, but everybody here is fortunate to welcome Pablo León de la Barra, who is an extraordinary colleague that I've had the opportunity to spend considerable time with over the past year. Prior to that, we met in Mexico, but we have never spent so much intense time together.
Very intense.
Since he was appointed to be the UBS MAP curator for the Guggenheim Museum's Latin American Art Collection and Exhibition, an initiative that he accepted to take on, a humongous task. In 1 year, he had to not only collect and purchase and negotiate the 50 plus artworks that are in the museum at this moment. And the exhibition actually ends next Wednesday, the 1st of October, so any of you that haven't seen it might want to run and have the last chance to do so. So I don't know if Pablo does need any introduction, since he's had such a huge amount of public and media attention as a result of this Guggenheim UBS MAP curatorialship. And he's become somewhat of a popular figure amongst many of his here tonight. But I see a lot of students here, so I'll just proceed to read out some of the more important facts of his career. The exhibition, but before that I want to talk a little bit about the exhibition, which presents a plethora of critical issues that here at SVA tonight we decided not to address. Suffice to say, because there's many that have been circulating, but I will give my personal issue, the numero uno issue, which is with the Guggenheim Museum's pretension that a museum such as theirs can actually build a Latin American art collection in the space of 1 year, despite the fact that I have every confidence in Pablo's accomplishments and his eye and his long-standing selection and criteria for selection. It is, from a museum's point of view, if we think about museum collections, it is nonetheless a pretension to think that you can build a collection in 1 year. Most museums take decades, if not hundreds of years, to build a collection. But he decided that he would be challenged and do it. So here we are. The other one of the
you know, Brasilia was built in 5 years, no?
Yeah. Well, we're sort of we're sort of like trying to get a consensus going about, said, really pushing the Guggenheim to make this a continual position, so that he can continue to collect.
We'll do in 5 years what wasn't done in 50.
Yeah, exactly.
But then afterwards they had dictatorships.
And then we're going to go and do something that nobody else has done, which is maybe collect art from the South Pole or something. I don't know. But anyway, there have been a lot of critical issues floating around, being voiced by various colleagues. And one of them was the usual one: what are the criteria for inclusion or exclusion? For instance, if Luis Kamnitzer and Juan Downey are included, then why not Jaime Davidovich? Or if Marta Minujín is there, why not Liliana Porter or Catalina Parra? And if Rafael Ferrer is there...
You forgot Cecilia Vicuña also.
Cecilia Vicuña. If Rafael Ferrer is there, then why not Rafael Montañez Ortiz? And finally, there is the eternal question regarding geographically based collections and exhibitions, and whether they are still a viable model today. We won't go into these unless there's enough time in the end of what we will talk about tonight, and unless Pablo feels like he wants to address them. So for those who are still unfamiliar with his career, Pablo is known to be an exhibition maker, an independent curator, a researcher, an editor, and blogger.
Independent. No?
Independent. And now he's dependent. Pretty soon you'll be independent again. Anyway, he is specialized in the relationship between contemporary art and architecture, and holds a PhD in history and theories from the Architectural Association in London. Besides being the UBS MAP curator for Latin America at the Guggenheim, he has, among other exhibitions, curated the following: To Be Political, It Has to Look Nice, 2003 at Apex and Art in General here in New York. PR04, Biennale at Puerto Rico in 2004. Puerto Rico 2004, PR. George and the Dragon at the ICA 2005 in London. This Is Not America, 2009 at Beta Local in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, Yucatan, and Elsewhere, 2010, at the Centro Cultural de España in Guatemala, and 2011 at the Museo Tamayo in Mexico City. Bananas is My Business, The South American Way, 2011, co-curated with Julieta González at the Museo Carmen Miranda in Rio de Janeiro, and Microclimas at the Kunsthalle in Zurich. Prior to that, he did many very exciting adventures on his own in London, some of which, one was called the 24/7, was that? And they were sort of like in these offbeat locations, a closet, sort of in the cracks and crevices of the official spaces out there. So he's been very innovative in also considering that location shouldn't be an issue, institutions should not be needed, that you can create exhibitions in any and all of the spaces that we have around us. He has also written much for publications like Spike in Austria, Wallpaper in London, Celeste in Mexico, Ramona in Buenos Aires, and Metropolis M in Amsterdam. He's participated in countless international symposiums and conferences, and he's the editor of his own blog called Center for the Aesthetic Revolution. In this blog, Pablo, and since its inception, on the right side banner, if you look at it online, he has an ongoing Jacques Rancière quote in which Rancière comments on the letters on the Aesthetic Education of Mankind by Friedrich Schiller, an 18th century philosopher and poet. And it's a really interesting kind of quote that he has there because it tells you a lot about how he thinks about exhibition making. And also as an artist, because Pablo occasionally does his own artwork as well.
Not really, but...
Not anyway. You're in a show right now called Beyond the Super Square.
That's research, Carla. That's visual research. No?
Yeah, exactly. So like Friday's symposium at the Guggenheim, where Pablo hosted a group of cross-generational curators of Latin American art, rather than talk about the exhibition, we'll instead talk about three of the concerns that run throughout Pablo's curatorial practice, from his initial projects to today, and even including the Guggenheim Museum. One is the contemporary paradigm of the tropical, which we have up here, which was a loaded criteria for my generation. I only have to quote Myth and Magic, The Art of the Fantastic, etc. One that we have battled to bury, or at least stay clear of, given that tropical references and represents animated and produced expectations of the stereotypical and of the colorful border of the south of the border type of art.
Yeah. I never thought about that because of the relation with your generation, but you understand the idea of magical realism and how people protested against
exactly.
And how we moved beyond the fantastic. No?
Yeah, so that's why when we initially saw all of this Tropicalia, I mean, unless it dealt with Tropicalia and Helioiticica, our generation stayed away from anything that smelled or looked tropical, tropicoso. And especially because that perception comes from the United States, and we are here, and we're located here, and it's from here that we look at these exhibitions. Today, Pablo has, with several of his younger generation, brought the tropical back, and he brought it back center stage, which is really interesting. So what were the impulses that brought this change about Pablo's work? And we will soon see that when he starts showing you some examples. And the second one is that there's no fixed definition of Latin American art, nor do we have distinctive regional styles. Moreover, today's globalizing art making and curatorial practices seem to call for specific cities and art scenes in which architecture and its derivations have become the core protagonists. In his role as curator, as artist, or artist as curator, why has architecture and art become so intertwined in Latin America today? And he has certainly addressed that in many of his exhibitions prior to the Guggenheim. And even in the Guggenheim to some extent, because they gave him a real awkward space.
By the time we finish, the time will run out.
No, we're getting there. And then the third one is the social political dimension of art from Latin America today, which is represented as something that's cool, fun, and smart, rather than the previous generation's serious, ideologically motivated, hardcore conceptual artworks. So those are kind of the three topics that we'll be talking about.
I'm very honored to be here and to be introduced by such a legend that's Carla. We met, Julieta and I, we met Carla for the first time maybe 4 years ago?
Yeah, 5, I think.
5 years ago in Mexico. and suddenly realized that she was the editor of this great magazine that had existed in the 70s, of which we knew about, Artes Visuales. And I think what's really interesting about that magazine that you were doing at the time, she was based in Mexico, but had a global vision towards art, but with a special perspective towards the South or to Latin America. So really connecting what at the time was disconnected and creating kind of networks of thought and relationship between different art practitioners at the moment, no?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
so
Juan was one of them. Juan Downey was one of the ones that we.
So for me it was a revelation. And then when I moved to New York to make this project, I didn't have where to live, and Carla was very kind to offer me the possibility. Carla offered me the possibility to stay in her house every now and then when I needed somewhere to stay. Of course, I had to pay her, but.
Snip, snip.
But I mean, it was amazing to have access to her, one, to her library, but two, to her mental library, and to be able to see through her memories major episodes of art that I hadn't lived, but I knew about it. And in a way, for those that saw the exhibition, she also had some kind of influence in what's shown there. Answering to some of your questions, I won't answer to all because that's another topic. But I thought that it was very important in the exhibition not to talk only about the contemporary and about artists working today, which was kind of the original aim of the project before I got there, but to connect it to other previous generations, and especially the one working in the 60s, 70s, 80s, which were not present in the Guggenheim collection. So it was something I had to fight for it to happen. It was not the aim of the exhibition, not the aim of the project. So of course we couldn't have everyone. We couldn't have so we had to choose among
I imagine.
And then you have to work with. I mean, again, when you do collections, that's another topic. But you have to work with what's available, prices. What makes sense also with the kind of exhibition you're proposing. For example, Jaime Davidovich is a fantastic artist, but his work is very specific, talking about certain media and the use of television, which is a topic that doesn't appear so much in the exhibition. You know, he would need a proper exhibition for himself. You know, like to show all his works. And
I kind of have a different idea, but that's another topic.
That's
for
but
later.
Just because she started with a strong hand. Questioning things.
I think we should go back.
So I need to defend myself before.
Don't defend yourself. It's the show talks for itself, and I think it's a.
So no, but basically what Carla asked me was she wanted to see some earlier works. She wanted to see where I had started my practice, in what moment I had decided that curating was what I was going to do, in what way I could also connect with some of the practices that some of you as students are doing today. And I thought that was an interesting thing to do, to look a little bit back and to learn a little or relearn.
And I thought it was also interesting because of the student body, because there might be a lot of artists here who might contemplate acting as curators or become curator as artists and artists as curator. So I wanted to show how Pablo got to where he is today by looking at his earlier projects.
But just to give you some basic ideas, I'm not going to show everything. But she asked me, I mean, when we did a kind of rehearsal for what is this talk, she asked me, in what moment did you define your practice, or did you decide that you were doing curating? And then I thought that I think this was the moment when it happened, and it's. I was invited to this project in Puerto Rico, a kind of biennale, non-government biennale, where different artists were invited to do or work in projects in different selected places. I was invited to work in El Cerro de Naranjito, an hour from Puerto Rico, together with other artists. Chemi Rosado, an artist from there, had been working painting the houses of the community in different shades of green. So
a shanty town, right?
Yeah, kind of a shanty town. A small village. So it was a shanty town of un pueblito, but the shanty town of that village. So basically, an economy of how would you call their economy?
Informal.
Yeah, the economy of subsistence of a drug-based economy, or a informal drug-based economy. And what Shemi had done was in a way using art and using painting, had activated a series of relationships with the community. So that made it much more easier for us outsiders that came to work there. There already was a door open. There already had been a work developed during a year, which allowed us to work the community. Still, it was a very kind of socially charged. As you see, with the last one, there was police action every day trying to find who was selling the drugs, who was doing what. So I took over an old community center that had been abandoned, that had been used originally as a medical center, dentist, and later had become a place that people had crashed in and would use to inject heroin. And then it had been kind of shut down. So we cleaned it up and decided to convert it into a museum for the community. So basically what I did, visited all the houses, introduced myself and asked them for a work of art that we could borrow to construct this temporary museum, which in a way would tell the story of the place. Of course, the reaction was, "Oh, I don't have any work of art. There's nothing here that's real art." So it was choosing with them symbolic elements that when put together and put in dialogue would tell a story of the place. So this is the kind of the most basic the example. A woman that had these black angels in her house, and the story was that she knew that there should be black paintings of black angels somewhere, because there's a song called Angelitos Negros, but she couldn't find it, so she commissioned a painter to paint her the angels. Somebody else in their house had this framed poster of the arrival of the Spanish, and you have the original Taino Indians that lived in the island, which most of them disappeared. And then another framed image of a member of the community that had migrated to New York, so a New Yorican. So in a way, with three images, and by putting them together, telling the story of the place. So that was kind of the exercise that I did. In other cases, when people had no works of art, it was maybe we could borrow a plant and build an interior garden. Someone else had drawings of the people in the community made in cigarette cartons. Others made reggaeton, this kind of Puerto Rican music that many of you know, but that was kind of the early beginnings of reggaeton. And then one of the rich ladies of the village had a proper work of art, which was the Mona Lisa. So she sent her sons or her workers to carry the Mona Lisa all the way to the community center museum, which actually, I mean, at the time I didn't think of it, but it was almost like a procession, like a kind of Francis Alice like taking the artworks to the PS1, or Javier Telles carrying the lion. But I wasn't thinking in art terms or art language at the time. I almost didn't know. I mean, I had seen some images of Marcel Brodauer's Museum of the Eagles, but it was really kind of intuitive, putting things together. I wanted a sign that said museum that could be seen from the parking lot of the village, so people would know there was going to be a museum there. But when we hung it, it broke down and just laid there in the floor. And then we're having the people from the place come and visit it. So basically, that was the first time when I had done other previous exercises, but really when I think that this was what I was doing as a curator. Many years later, I came about with this project by Group Material, which I don't know if you know. It's a group of artists that were very active in the 80s. Julie Out and. I forgot his name.
Felix González
Torres. Yeah, Felix was part of the group, but the other.
Andrés Serrano was part of it.
Douglas. So they had done in 1981 a similar project.
Kim Rollins.
A similar project here in New York that they called People's Choice, and then they subtitled, like somewhere here it says, arroz con mango, which is basically a mix of things. And they invited different members of their Puerto Rican or New York neighbors where they had their office to bring things and show their artwork. So again, this thing that sometimes we don't invent anything, that history is there for us to discover, that this kind of things happen, that it's not context change. So it's also about how you put things together to give new meanings at different.
Not too long ago, Julie Auld recreated that whole group material at Artist Space.
Yeah.
It was a great show.
But it was more her collection, no? Or she did.
It's more a collection, but some of the same objects that you have here, shown here.
And I mean, actually, if you see the other of their exhibitions, no, the timeline for support of Latin America, or I mean, they come a little bit from this idea, no?
Yeah.
Their age timeline, so you see the idea being developed. So more than check my work, check groups material, which I think is a great influence for someone interested in exhibitions.
Yeah, it is.
Now what? Next? Or you want to add something?
No, I'm fine.
So, I mean, what's funny also that parallel at that time, there was also this interest about what a museum could be and rethinking a museum, which has been something that's been present in my practice and in my thinking continuously all this time. So, I mean, sometimes I use this case study. It's the case study of Puerto Rico, which makes sense because the other museum was in Puerto Rico. But it's not that I want to make a strong emphasis that in Puerto Rico the museums are not working. Or, I mean, it's similar in many other cases in Latin America. It's not that I want to point at my finger on Puerto Rico. Although, I mean, so basically what happens in Puerto Rico, they have two museums, so the structures are there, but they really don't function as they should. You know, for example, this is a few years ago, but this is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Puerto Rico, and an exhibition of David LaChapelle. So why do they show David LaChapelle, and what relationship does it have to the place and to the artists there? Why don't they show the artists of the place? But it's something that happens in many of the other places. You know, it's not a specific of Puerto Rico. It's so I don't want to.
It's happening more and more.
So this thing, museums that don't have any budget, don't have money to pay curator, to make exhibitions, to have a program, but they have money from sponsors to bring David LaChapelle, which has nothing to do with.
Yeah.
But it's something that the sponsors think it's cool.
They think it's up there.
So anyway, and the other museum, the main museum, the Museo de Arte Puerto Rico, they have some kind of prizes for young people. I think this is kind of the Honda or Hyundai or whatever. Some car brand prize for young artists, where they do these amazing sculptures. I hope it's not of any of yours. And the thing that it does more or less well is the idea of the museum as a place that takes care of the past and of the works and puts them together, no? So, and puts them in dialogue. So this idea of the museum as a refrigerator. No? These are some photos I took of the time of sometimes what normal people think of culture and the kind of exhibitions that everybody goes to see, no? Or the kind of concerts and things that people think is culture.
Yeah, really.
So really, what we do has little importance for the general of the public, no? So when I was talking about this, an artist from Puerto Rico created these drawings as a response to what I was saying. And at the time, there was a law that happened in Puerto Rico that said that because the people of the housing estates, how do you call them here? The
housing department?
The projects, the people from the projects were not paying electricity because they were stealing it from the electricity grid, that they would all pay, let's say, I'm making it up, but they would pay $8 a month, and then they would have all the electricity they wanted. So Tony Cruz, an artist from Puerto Rico, made this drawing in which he decided, okay, so maybe what we could do is have the museum steal the electricity from the projects, no? And that way the museum won't spend all the money in paying the air conditioning, and then they will have money to pay a curator and pay an exhibition and have a program, and so kind of responses to. And then, well, again, Puerto Rico. I mean, there's loads of collectors there, and they all buy paintings of bananas made by U.S. American market artists, in this case, Wade and Goyton, instead of buying paintings with bananas by local artists. No, so this kind of thing of. So this has made me have this thing in the mind all the time of to rethink the museum, or what kind of museum you should build, or what the contents of this museum should be. So I think, for example, things that have influenced me, in this case, Mario Pedrosa, a Brazilian art critic and thinker, and this project that he had of what a museum in the new capital of Brasilia should be. And he writes to Oscar Niemeyer, "My dear Oscar, we shouldn't build in Brasilia another museum of modern art following the ones that are done in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo. Doing this in Brasilia would only add to the list of incomplete museums, because he knew that it wouldn't be why do another kind of museum that doesn't work, no? So he says what we should do in Brasilia is, and I'm going to just go quickly over it, but do a museum of copies that would have copies of everything that exists in the other museums, So we would ask to all the museums to give us photographic copies of their paintings, to do plaster copies of, and then we would have the whole history. And he makes this list of, he really wants to do an encyclopedic museum in Brasilia, the capital of, the newly built capital of Brazil, no? So from prehistoric to...
I once proposed that in the Museo de Arte Moderno in Mexico, since there was so little money. There was such a desire.
Louder because they won't hear you.
There was such a desire to bring, to try and bring these kind of like major figures of art history. And I said, why don't we just, everybody's seen them in reproduction so often, why don't we just build, just the basis for them and the space and the lighting and everything, we just put the label there, because everybody already can imagine the pieces, and that way we save a lot of money.
Yeah.
But copies would have been good too.
I think in the future, I don't know, they'll either be plotted or holograms or no. Or,
it's
Not
imaginary.
the original one. Yeah. But anyway, what's interesting is that at least he was kind of rethinking it as a kind of world, proper world museum. It's not the typical European North American line of history, but he kind of has different civilizations and indigenous.
He was an extraordinary man. He also was the one who created the museum in Chile.
Yeah, the Salvador Allende Museum, which that's another history, and influenced the similar museum in Nicaragua after the revolution.
Yeah.
But that will be going into another.
And then he went into exile in Paris, which was the last time I saw him.
And he defended the exercise of freedom. So anyway, again, Harold Seaman thinking about the museum, and saying the ideal museum would be the one that was closed by the authorities, and then thinking about the collection. The collection is a memory bank. Another friend, Clementine Delis, is thinking about the idea of her ethnographic museum where she works in Frankfurt, and again the idea of coming from Carl Einstein of the museum as a dynamic living school, where it would be between display and a laboratory. And the museum not as a preserved jar, no? Rafael Ortiz Montañez talking about the Museo del Barrio and when he founded it, the idea that it's more about the content and not what contains it. And then he also says in one conversation, he says, that all exhibitions in the museum should start with the rainforest, in the Museo del Barrio. So that would be the way of entering the museum, to have the kind of this.
That'd be great on Fifth Avenue.
I don't know if he ever made it. He said the other day, I asked him, and he said that in the early exhibitions at the museum, he had this rainforest. But I asked him for photos, and he doesn't remember if there's any. This is just, this has nothing to do. It's just a museum in.
Did you do a mock picture of it?
Yeah, it's a museum in Iquitos that.
In Iquitos,
Yeah. This another artist from Mexico, Pedro Reyes. So again, the idea about the museum, the museum could be a fridge, a place where to preserve things, or an oven where to cook new realities. This is Rem Koolhaas, how to build a collection. And he says, okay, it needs planning, to do a museum of 800 rooms. You invite 8 artists, scientists, or individuals a year, give them a room for the year, and after 100 years, you'll have the museum of the whole century. So this thing about building and.
I think we should start that right now.
Okay, so 8 candidates. And then your dear friend Luis Kamitzer. The idea that the museum is also a school where the artist learns to communicate and the public learns to make the connection. So all these different ideas.
He's done us the favor of creating a teacher's manual in Spanish and English, teacher's guide.
This he did for the exhibition, so the exhibition at the Guggenheim. So it was one of the great things that we could do as part of the exhibition, is invite him to develop the exhibition guide and to work with the education team in rethinking the kind of exhibition material. So I mean, I have it in PDF also. So if somebody wants it and doesn't want to pay the $8 that it costs, I can send it to you and you can.
Yeah, $8 in tax. Some students.
And you can circulate it.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, so all this brought me to this project that I did in 2010. I was invited by a friend of mine, Kiki Mazzucchelli, a Brazilian curator. She was thinking of idea of doing an exhibition in a poster, so invited different people to do posters for this exhibition that could circulate as posters. And for me, it was the opportunity to put many ideas together of and creating this kind of tropical diagram. So I was very interested, one, in the idea of the tropics, but also the idea of the tropics going beyond the tropicalia and the fantastic, and a way of connecting different moments that had appeared in my different travels through Latin America, to connect these different moments and to create kind of a network of many of these ideas, artists, and research that maybe were not or hadn't been connected. No? So in a way, it was a response to the typical diagram of modern art. This is Alfred Barr's diagram for the exhibition Cubist and Abstract Art and MoMA 1936. So basically, he arrives to the idea of where American abstract art comes from. But what's important is that how movements that come from other cultures, they exist like outside of culture. No, it's these things that are appropriated, no, but are not considered
absorbed and integrated.
So then I started to do a research on this kind of diagrams and how history had been told through also trees of life, and I found this very early example. Which is the Tree of Modern Art, was done by Miguel Covarrubias. Miguel was a Mexican anthropologist, but also cartoonist. He lived in New York. He worked for Vanity Fair doing cartoons.
Yeah.
And he created basically a timeline of European art history as a tree. And what's interesting is that, how far do we go? How far does he go? There's Kandinsky, there's Modigliani, for example, there. But for example, he never arrives to, there's Picasso, and Picasso and Modigliani, and they were close to Rivera when Diego Rivera was in France,
in Paris.
And I don't see Diego Rivera anywhere.
Modi is next to the Quirico, there.
Yeah, here's Quirico, they're kind of a Cleese here. So this kind of still, even though he was from Mexico, he was still writing the kind of European, North American history.
Also, that map, that was done in 1933.
33, yeah, before.
He would have done another one 10 years later.
Which maybe would have been totally influenced by his trips to, who knows,
Bali.
And then you find Ad Reinhardt, which is much more fun. No? He's much more, he continues with the idea, but he creates a much more critical history of North American art. And here you finally have the Mexican art influence, which is pulling down the branch of American art. It's kind of breaking it down. And then he says things like this, like, if you have any friends that we overlooked, here are some extra leaves, fill in and paste them up. So everybody can enter the history of Reinhardt.
I also like the one in the very, sorry.
Oh, good.
On the very right here.
The escapist?
Yeah, he escaped. Escapist art. Ran away from all the movements.
And this kind of cemetery, where all the kind of artists that didn't make it.
Working for Lucky Strike, Pepsi.
The sponsors.
The then sponsors in 46.
And the four roots of modern art. No? And this is a much more recent kind of diagram, which is very interesting because this is Gerhard Richter, and it totally exemplifies the white male kind of domination white male straight domination of culture. No? He divides it in different fields. So he has painting, architecture, music, philosophy, literature, architects. Basically, they are all male. I think the only woman that appears is his ex-wife.
Isa Gensken.
Isa Gensken. The only Oriental that appears is Onkawara, and I think that's it. I think it's basically like white European and North American artists, thinkers, philosophers. I mean, it's a beautiful diagram. But,
yeah, I'm glad I didn't read the amount of names being only men, because it is very pretty.
And then, I mean, other recent examples. This is a Tate Modern. And when they opened their collection, they presented this timeline where they kind of want to tell the history of last century. And here it's until almost 99, no? When Gabriel Orozco appears. And then, I mean, Felix González Torres, which has been or needed to be a little bit further down.
Ernesto Neto.
You have like somewhere, where's Ernesto? Jorge Pardo here, Francis Alice, which must be furious that he should be like closer to Orozco. No? And yeah, even after Abraham Cruz Villegas and Amiel Ortega, the sons of Orozco, you know, so there's kind
He's
of
earlier,
I
right?
think they were just putting names. Lothar Van Garten, come on, Lothar Van Garten here, we should have him further behind. Anyway, so questioning this kind of lines and histories and trying to build one. I work close with Mel Duarte, who was the designer working on the posters, and like originally we thought about making a tree or a palm tree, and then suddenly the idea of it becoming a banana bunch happened. So also connecting all these moments in a banana bunch was kind of difficult, no? Trying to make them connect and relate. So it semi-worked. It's a bit rhizomatic, the connection between bananas. But basically, you would start with the first travelers that arrived to America that were painting and were drawing the continent, which somebody got angry that I said that they were also colonizing the territories through drawing the other day, this curator. But I mean, while doing drawings and representing, they were also saying what was available, how the territory was, what was.
I mean, later on, those explorers, whatever their findings were being used by.
Yeah, no, but even people like, for example, Catherwood and Stevens that went to Central America and to Mexico to do the Yucatan traveling. They later were involved in trying to find a route for the canal. You know, so they were not that innocent as.
Well, the case of Humboldt, he was definitely a scientist and he was also a liberator. I mean, he was in favor of Bolivar and people. But yeah, a number of them were definitely.
Yeah, but what I say is that they cannot be seen as so innocent, you know?
No, the majority of them came also so that the trains could be built and
anyway,
mining.
Then it moves to kind of the modern tropical moments. Again, trying to make connections between different moments happening in different countries, many that had been disconnected, and then coming to the period of the 60s and 70s, and there's this big break, which is kind of the moment of the dictators that happened in most of repressive governments that happened in most of Latin America, and then moving forwards to the current movement. So
I love your last kind of summary here.
Which in this sense, to be tropical is not a question of localization, it's a question of attitude. In that way, Carla can also be tropical even though she's blonde, you know? Now, Carla is actual tropical because if you know, she, and that's why maybe she's interested in all this, because Carla was born in Indonesia, so.
Below the equator, it was really tropical.
Between the tropics. And she actually moved to Mexico because her father was a tropical agronomist.
Yeah, tropical agronomist.
So you moved to Veracruz.
So I lived with all of these things my entire life. Yeah, meaning that it's not a question of place, but it's a question of attitude.
And again, some ideas that influence this kind of idea of wanting to turn the map around, to kind of rethink other ways of reading these, but even Smithson's way of planting again those unrooted trees. See how I skipped that work? And I mean, I'm going to kind of go fast through this because we don't have much time, but it's kind of the basic kind of again, the first draftsman and explorers drawing. This I really like, Frederick Edwin
Yeah,
Church.
it's a fantastic
Who
painting.
did the beautiful paintings. But then when he brought them back to the States, he would present them like really as a spectacle. You know, he would put plants in the room, he would light them especially, he would charge people to come and try and see them. So it was something between a panorama. I mean, it was not shown as a panorama, but this kind of idea of showing the kind of tropics in a kind of atmosphere, installation, a spectacle.
There's pictures of this first museum on the corner of Houston and Broadway today that burned down, and he would actually show these paintings there. And in conjunction, there were also these animals that were brought, you know, these some taxidermic and some for real. So it became this whole sort of environment installation.
And then, well, thinking and putting together certain moments like, okay, Rousseau painting from without ever being in the jungle, just going to the zoo, or then the first kind of cubist jungle, Wilfredo Lam, but also kind of integrating all the kind of Afro-religious elements within the painting. And then the history of Wilfredo Lam and coming in the same boat as Levi-Strauss fleeing from Europe during the wars. But Levi-Strauss never mentions him in Tristes Tropics. You know, he talks about Breton being there, he talks about all the other intellectuals, but
I didn't know that.
But he totally forgets. So there's Levi-Strauss, no? And then, well, Tristes Tropics, how he tells all his travel going to the tropics. And basically the sadness being that he knows that all these things that are saying, especially the cultures that he's analyzing when he goes deep into the jungle, that they will disappear, you know, that they won't be there. So the sadness comes from there. But all the kind of transition and arriving to the tropics serve to differentiate this kind of space, time, climate, and how it differs from European conceptions of, again, space, time, and place. No? Mm-hmm. I'm just rushing a little bit through because we won't have much. A great trilogy that needs to be also presented and studied, but the kind of education, religion, theater, architecture. I mean, we would need here also the theology of liberation to make this kind of the dictatorship. Then Elio Itizica as the great kind of rethinking of doing art from the tropics. Again, I won't stop much, but this transition from kind of abstraction that starts to move, you already see it moving in the metaschemas, and starts to become alive until it really becomes a space, but also it becomes caves that you wear. I wish I had this photo to show. But no, this kind of atmosphere. So this really transition from cube to kind of lived spaces that you can go inside. This is the Tropicalia installations at the Museum of Modern Art, 1967. And then Whitechapel Eden experience. Here you see Caetano wearing the cape, and basically you see the whole transition, no? From the metaschemas to the nucleus to walking towards space to wearing kind of the painting and then going into the space, no? And what he talks about the transformation of the spectator into a participator, no? So this kind of feeling of being alive. And well, Caetano, Chalala, the difference with Caetano, our dear friend Sueli going, no, it's Dominique here that we want to speak, Dominique Gonzalez in the 90s, which brings again a new reading to the idea of the tropics, and especially this kind of the idea of that it's how can we tropicalize spaces, or how can the coldness of the rationality of modernity, when it exists in the tropics, it gets contaminated not only by vegetation, not only by plants, not only by humidity, but that this creates also a space where other kind of things can happen, no? And other kind of feelings can emerge, and other kind of relationships can be created. So this kind of later moment in the 90s, I'm just going through and this idea that you can tropicalize spaces and create tropicalization. For example, this is the work she did for the Sao Paulo Biennale of 2006, where the columns underneath the park of Ibirapuera start multiplying as if they were trees or vegetation. No? So the architecture starts becoming and multiplying. And then like funny moments, you know, also kind of moments of humor that are very present. No? Here, for example, from Carmen Miranda to Barry Manilow and a Copacabana song and Ney Mato Grosso, but also figures of liberation and also kind of liberation through music. Celia Cruz, I mean, actually Carmen Miranda and Celia Cruz are like proto-transvestites, no? So they're really kind of liberation of transgender liberation. And then, I mean, in the new generations, also artists working with banana, whatever. This will take us to the next moment. I did this thing that, same as Reinhardt, I was like, okay, so if your friends are not there, put a banana for your friends. And all these people started to get angry, like, oh, why is my banana not there? Include me in include me there. Or don't take my name out. Or I'll kill you if I. So just kind of trying to think this intervention.
Are you going to reprint it?
No, it's been reprinted. I mean, there was a new version in 2012. So it really started going out of the banana and kind of going crazy. But I tried to create more connections and more. I mean, and what's great is really because it exists as a poster. So these were some of the posters that were done for the original exhibition. I mean, it does circulate in this way. The original posters were kind of thick, so they were more difficult to send at transport. But then for other editions, like for example, this is an exhibition in Paris.
Just take it.
So it was color green and thinner, so more easier to take. This was an exhibition in Panama. They made it printed in yellow. This was an exhibition in Costa Rica. It was in the cheapest paper available. This is the one in Sao Paulo. It was in pink, smaller, so different. And this is the expanded version where you have more. And always exhibited with the whole history of the timeline that I show you, so people could know. So basically, also thinking about what kind of museum would contain everything that existed in this diagram, and if it should have a container or a building. So I was kind of sketching and trying to think what kind of building would it be? Would it have walls or not? And then some ideas that influenced it. For example, I thought a lot about Martin Kippenberger and this museum that he did in the island of Syros, in the Greek island of Syros, where basically he took over a concrete unfinished abattoir and transformed it into the MoMAs, so the Museum of Modern Art of Syros, which basically was a sign made by his friend Christopher Wool that transformed the place into a museum, and he would invite his friends for the summer to do different interventions or moments, kind of ephemeral moments that happened. So then I went to visit my dear friend Maria Papadimitru, a Greek artist that was assistant of Kippenberger at the time, and she received me arriving to the island with this sign saying MoMAs, so next to the people offering pensions where to stay, and she took me to see the place. This is before Mario Garcia Torres, the artist, went to do his work about.
Oh, that's true.
About MoMAs. So we went to see the place, which had now become a water treatment plant, and it's now enclosed. No? So that's the memory that remains of it. I think again of Marcel Baudouwers and his Museum of Art Moderne, the Eagles department, and how he collects all these moments of history related to the representation of the eagle, but also related to the colonial history of Belgium, no? Mm-hmm. And the idea of the plants around it. No? Again, the idea of the discover, having to discover the documents between the plants. Again, thinking how the museum would be, always the idea of the hammock very present. Lucio Costa, his installation for the Triennale de Milan in '64. Here I always forget, but we should have in between an image of the Cosmococas of
Elio's hammocks were later, no?
Yeah, after he comes to New York, and I think only one was installed during his lifetime. But yeah, they should be here.
We're the artists that have all of them in this place. Where was it, in Costa Rica?
In Costa Rica, the people from Proyectos Ultravioleta. So, no, but basically it's the idea, that's why we should have Oiticica's image of the slide here. The idea that Oiticico presents of his concept of crélaser, the idea of creation and leisure being possible together as a response to the alienation of overproduction of capitalism. No? So another way of thinking and producing that maybe the Tropic allows. And then thinking again about the architecture, how could it be? So some influences, for example, Pabellon Cuba, this kind of celebration of socialism, triumphal architecture in the tropics. So this kind of concrete ceiling underneath which different structures and moments and garden happen. Or this is in the jungles of central Mexico. Edward James, a British aristocrat that built this surrealist concrete jungle where stairs go nowhere, and it'll happen.
And this is being used by so many artists
yeah.
as a
in the last 5 years, it has become
and resourcing it. Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's also this kind of, that's another thing, no? But this kind of tourism of certain moments of last century. No? Art is going to Oscar Niemeyer's Canoa house. Art is going to Lina Bobardi house. Art is going to Gilitla. So
Artigas' house. Do you think it has to do with this idea of the failure of modernity in Latin America?
That's another topic that would take us a whole other day to discuss.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about the place is that it's really like entering his mind. You know, like you're in the jungle and you're in the, I mean, there you have him, you know, like the eccentric building, these structures of concrete in the jungle, you know, like being carried around. We've run out of time. And really kind of enjoying the darkest secrets that the jungle had to offer him. No?
Who's this, Herzog?
No, it's him. It's Edward James.
That's Edward James.
It's not Fitzcarraldo.
It's probably gone Fitzcarraldo next.
Fitzcarraldo. More structures of concrete. And then I say, okay, this kind of becomes the manifesto of the, and it's, sorry, I have it in English somewhere, but here it's in Spanish. But anyway, it talks about how this architecture should be, if the architecture should contain the artworks that appear in the diagram or not. And then it says something like, will it have walls or not? Maybe it will have mosquito nets, or maybe, and it says, due to the fact that it will be located somewhere in the tropics, in the future the museum will probably be covered by the jungle and will disappear. The plans of the museum will be inscribed somewhere in the floor, so it can be reconstructed in the future if the archaeologists find it and they decide.
And they can decipher it.
And they decide to reconstruct it. I've been thinking about which works could exist there, and how this would survive the climate. You know, how you could conserve works to survive the climate, and further than temporary or beyond temporary exhibitions in the style of the ones that Kippenberger did at MoMA's. Works that could be there would need to survive time and weather, so maybe there'll be no works exhibited in the museum. I'm basically thinking the museum as this kind of time capsule that could keep all the instructions to make these works again in the future if needed. No?
Or as a departure point to do other things.
Yeah. So anyway, just to end this last example, so this is a kind of very practical example of how the museum, the Tropical Museum, suddenly lands in a real place. And this is in Costa Rica, in a place called Teoretica. The curator of the place, or artistic director, Inti Guerrero, another Inti, for those under the same son of Inti, invited, he saw the banana diagram, and he said, oh, I want you to do the banana exhibition, I want you to do the exhibition about bananas. And I was like, it's not only about bananas, Inti, it's about... And he was like, I want your banana exhibition. So I was, okay, we'll give you the banana exhibition. If you want bananas, we'll give you...
How many bananas you got?
Bananas is our business. And so Teoretica is an institution in Central America that has been really important in kind of consolidating artistic practices in the region, a region that was really affected by the civil wars of the time, and really Virginia Perez Raton, who was the director, worked hard to give visibility to the artists of the region and to produce and to exhibit and to think. She died a few years ago, and then Inti was invited to be director, and he invited me to do this exhibition there. So basically the idea was also how to do a museum where there's a very small budget and I mean how to make it happen, how to make it in a place. So again, the idea that to do a museum you need a sign, as Kippenberg had the MoMA sign. So I invited local artist Federico Herrero, who's a painter, to make us a sign for the museum, for the Bananas Museum. And then inside, basically, you had tables made of the most simple way, trestles and doors with a glass on top, where different works were exhibited. So the idea, again, that you didn't need to show real works, but that you could show digital copies, or that the artist could send the work. And at the back, this work by by Minerva Cuevas.
Which is now in the Guggenheim show.
For those who went to the Guggenheim today, it was acquired for the collection, and which in a way is kind of Minerva using the language of Mexican muralism, you know, and advertisement. She talks about the influence of banana companies in the region. I mean, the negative influence of banana companies, which really controlled through the production of banana, the politics and economics of many of the countries.
Which made it banana republics.
Yeah, that's why they were called banana republics. So.
What's this piece of the bananas that were stamped?
It's coming.
Oh, okay.
And so yeah, that's Minerva Cuevas, but together with information about the different banana companies in Costa Rica. So really trying to localize it to the place, so different documents and publications. Then this, again, digital copies of a work by Fernando Bryce, and where he talks about this very specific moment in the history of Guatemala, where there was this coup d'etat against Jacobo Arbenz, the democratically elected president, who wanted to nationalize all the lands belonging to the banana companies. Of course, the president of the United Fruit Companies, with the help of his friends from the CIA, stopped this happening. And
it was really interesting about Fernando Bryce's pieces here. They're in German. So he takes these, he repurposes them from publications that he finds in Germany, because he's been living and working in Germany he's from Peru originally.
So kind of, yeah, rewriting or extracting from histories through drawing.
Right, so instead of going to, publications from Latin America or from the US, he goes to European ones, specifically from Hamburg and Berlin and places like that.
So I always talk about this kind of the dark history of what made possible that children in the United States could have bananas with their cornflakes every day and grow strong. You know, people from Central America say that people are in the States are bigger, not because of the hormones in the cows, but because of the bananas. That they ate from Central America. No? And well, it happened that Che Guevara was there at the time where the coup d'etat, so they say that was something that kind of pushed him further to fight against injustice in the continent. This is the archive of newspaper cutouts of Jose Alejandro Restrepo, of, again, the relationship of banana companies, in this case, to Colombia, and which also was part of the research for another work that he made, Musa Paradisiaca, so showing the kind of research done by artists. Then, again, through photocopies, making kind of a linear history of artists working with bananas, from the Quirico and the bust of Venus, the train of progress passing, and the bananas next to the bust, to other artists like Gabriel Orozco, the sleeping bag with banana leaves, Meyer Weissman, Turkey with the bananas, Francisco Toledo, the Mexican painter, a foot of him covered by a banana leaf.
Do you have Antonio Amaral in here too?
Not Antonio Amaral here, and not also the missing, I mean there's many missing, but not also the very important Guatemala painter, Jessica, the husband of Rosina, what's his name? The husband of Rosina Casali? Moises Barrios, who has also worked
What's his name?
Moises Barrios. He has worked extensively through painting the banana. I wanted to exhibit his paintings in Teoretica in the other space in front, but then it didn't happen. So, and then some works. This is interesting. The two only artists that didn't want to lend their work for the exhibition were the younger artists. You know, like the older artists, they were really cool. Like, yeah, I do photocopies. Here are the archives. Here are the digital files. Here are the JPGs. Wilfredo Prieto, or the collector that owns Wilfredo Prieto, didn't want to let us recreate his work, which is called Grasa, Jabón y Banana, which is basically in the floor, grease, a soap, and a banana. And Adriana Lara, a younger conceptual Mexican artist, didn't let us or allow us to reproduce her work called, I think, Skin or Banana, or maybe it's just Installation, where every day the security guard of the exhibition room eats a banana and throws the banana skin, the peel on the floor, because she thought it would exoticize her work to be in this context with other bananas. So.
She's following our model.
Yeah.
No exoticizing.
And also relating it to some works and artists from the place, this amazing thesis by a Costa Rican artist, Victoria Cabezas, that she did and submitted to the Florida State University as part of her master's degree of fine arts. This is the thesis that she did. And when I saw it, I almost died, that it was so incredible. So basically, she doesn't write any text as a main body of of the thesis, it only says banana, 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 banana. And it's in the footnotes that she starts telling the history of the politics of banana. I never knew if she was I didn't ask her if she was failed or passed, but I think it's like an amazing work of art, and I highly invite everyone to do their thesis here. Well, it's great, no? Because it says, like, for example, footnote 6, no? It is further stated that the tropics are not lands where the indolent native reclining comfortably in his hammock has only to reach out his hand and pluck his dinner from a banana tree. In the first place, tree-ripened bananas are not good. Well, fine. And then other works, this one by Milton Machado? Machado. I'm getting confused with the Miltons.
Yeah.
Early 1980s, so 78, I think it is. Idea to build a hotel in shape of a banana in the Bay of Guanabara in Rio de Janeiro, a mechanical hotel banana, which actually still today with what's happening in Rio de Janeiro, how it's reinventing itself through real estate and these new museums and constructions continues to be totally relevant. And then, of course, the eroticizing element of the banana. Mario Montes, hero, a Puerto Rican for me. I mean, the great transvestite muse of Andy Warhol, Jack Smith, and Elio Tizica in Agripina II, Manhattan, eating a banana. So again, the kind of sexual liberating element of banana. For me, I mean, the best Puerto Rican artist ever. I mean, if you were talking about Ortiz Montañez and Rafa Ferrer, I mean, the real one. The airport in Puerto Rico should be renamed after Mario Montes instead of Luis Martin.
Well, let's do a show on her then, him.
And then this work by a younger artist, Javier Bosques from Puerto Rico, living in LA. So fighting the banana flower. So again, this idea also, I mean, art is fighting this stereotype of the banana, sometimes imposed to them, sometimes chosen, sometimes not, but this kind of fight against. And finally, Carlo André Ibarra, an artist from Puerto Rico, tattooing, it's a performance where a tattoo man tattoos into the bananas different incidents or news reports relating to the free treaty agreements signed between the different Central American republics and the United States. So he tattoos them, and
so this piece will only remain as photo documentation because it's going to rot.
Yeah, it slowly becomes black as those treaties that they sign. You know, it rots as a.
Such a major piece.
Yeah. And well, that's it. You know, and in the side room there was a kind of the whole story of the diagram, the drawings for how the museum could be, and a cinema showing some of the works that appeared in the banana tree. No? So, and then already made by Radamés Juni Figueroa, an artist from Puerto Rico, the tropical fountain, tropical ready-made. So the idea is that you use local fruits, which here they didn't do it that well, no, because it's apples and whatever. You know, like I don't know, like it's one carambola that's kind of rotting. It's not and mixed with the juices of the place. So normally he mixes like whiskey and coconut. Here I think
looks like a tuna up there.
It's not a tuna. It's a carambolo, starfruit.
Ah.
And this idea also, I mean, again, the idea similar to the bananas, that in the tropics you don't have to work because you have bananas to hand. This idea of the never-ending fountain, it will never end, but of course there comes a moment when it ends and you only remain with the hangover of living in the tropics. So with this we end the idea of the museum in the tropics. So I come from architecture background, so I studied architecture. And I think in that terms, what it gave me was an understanding of space and how the works exist in the space, and how when you do an exhibition, you create a dialogue between them and in the space. Also coming from Mexico, it's, or having grown up in Mexico, it's something that's very present there all the time. That I mean, coming from the muralisms and the relationship between inscribing the skin or architecture with the murals, so the didactic material of murals, but then going back also to history, you know, from the kind of Mayan Bonampak reliefs or whatever. This relationship was also very present, but nowhere more present maybe than I don't know, like if you think of Matthias Geritz and Luis Barragan, and this kind of relationship where space becomes constituent, but also the relationship between the space and art in Matthias Geritz, the idea of el eco, the idea, I mean, it was, and those kinds of things, I think, I grew with them. No? A lot of my professors studied in architecture, studied under Matthias Geritz, so that was all that formation of the Bauhaus and then kind of the religious spirituality that came after. I mean, it was kind of fed to us without thinking when we were students. And
the museums that were built in Mexico during the 60s were all, the architects were working together with the artists.
The whole plastic integration thing. And so it's things that maybe are also part of one's history that you always... And I think at our architecture school at the time when I was studying, art architecture was not that different. I mean, at least I was also very influenced by things happening here at the moment. I loved John Hedjuk, which at the time was at Copper Union, and I learned a lot from the distance from what he was doing. Levos Woods, I invited him to give a talk in 1994 to Mexico, who was also kind of dealing with. So there was not much distinction at the time. Also, I mean, there were no curatorial studies. This kind of universities now having people go through masters and PhDs and stuff. It's a new thing, you know. It's part of the market, and we have to do it, because if not, you don't get a job, or you don't get to meet people, or you don't get to. But that didn't exist, you know. So most of the curators from my generation and the generation before and the one before, they didn't have that kind of training, you know.
They were called museógrafos.
Yeah. Or they came to architecture through museography.
Yeah.
Or many came from poetry, philosophy. Right. Others were artists like Adriano Pedrosa, Pablo Herkenhoff. Others from cinema. Like
the whole idea about it being the profession of a curator. Well, I don't know in other parts of Latin America necessarily, but for sure in Mexico, that didn't begin until Olivier de Bras started Curating. So we're talking of probably 82, 83, 84.
Some of the old curators that I've interviewed, Miguel González in Medellin, in Colombia, and also the nephew of Carlos Pellicer, who made this museum of Museo Poema in La Venta and the Museum of Archaeology.
But he didn't call himself a curator.
No, he didn't call a curator. But when you ask them how they do exhibitions, they are, both of them, funny enough, said the same thing. You know, I don't know if there was this school of curators that do nativities. You know. So they were like, yeah, it's about putting the one of the kings speaking with a star, and then putting the donkey to talk with the other donkey. So really about creating dialogue between the different elements that you put. So for me that was really interesting. Yeah. Did they teach you that lesson when you were young?
Yeah, when I grew up, it was.
Did you go to that school of nativities?
Well, I was sort of like, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not that far back, but this. But I mean, I was mentored by someone who, with his generation, they had started to put together these collections and these museums and the way to install them based on their discoveries in, you know, with Carlos Pellicer
But even MoMA, I mean, MoMA, if you think here, René de Hanocourt, who ended up MoMA, he was
William Spratling.
He was a handicraft collector, you know, he was really
and even William Spratling in Tasco. I mean, it sort of like was this organic thing. You would look at these spaces and you would look at all of these remnants, historical remnants, and put them together. And then as they started digging, then they got these objects that they would, you know, place in these spaces. The first museum of anthropology was called the Museo de Culturas, and it was behind the National Palace in downtown historical Mexico. And then, like in '64, the Museum of Anthropology was built. So it took a long time. So all of these people that were kind of responsible for building these museums and these collections started by looking at the architectural spaces themselves, the Teotihuacan and the Palenque and all of these areas, and then from there they moved on to create these spaces.
I think it's great that in Mexico you have all these new structures and all these new museums. In one hand, I think, I mean, on one hand, it comes from different wills of making this thing happen, but also because the artistic community has defended their spaces and fought for them, which I think is something that has, so they deserve the spaces they have, which in a way I think it's great. I think the only problem sometimes, and it happens elsewhere, is that there's too much focus on the contemporary, you know? And sometimes you would like to see the contemporary contaminated by other things, you know? I mean, sometimes when you go to exhibitions, you're bored about just seeing like objects of consumption of the modern art, of the contemporary art market, you know, existing in a.
So what would you like to see more of that?
I mean, I'm thinking, for example, the ideas the ideas of Pedrosa for the museum, you know, like mixing. I mean, much more mix of different disciplines, different documents, different. I mean, one example could be, I'm not sure if it's the right one, but in Rio de Janeiro, the Museum of Art of Rio, which is run by, directed by Pablo León, who was the curator that did the Anthropophagia Biennale of 1998, which was a kind of the changing moment for that Biennale. And he's studying different moments that relate to Rio, to Brazilian culture, or showing art from other places that go beyond the Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo axis, or showing what a history of modernism in Recife, or what artists in Salvador are doing now. There was an exhibition of the Amazonias, on one dealing with the city and slave trade. So really kind of using art and exhibitions as a tool of research also, which I think is sometimes that like we just get too obsessed in the idea of the contemporary. And,
just to add, I mean, it's surprising that none of the curators in Mexico has looked at what contemporary indigenous groups are producing.
Yes.
Not so much looking at the tradition, how the tradition perpetuates itself, but to look at it from an avant-garde or from an innovative and from an experimental point of view.
I
because
think
many of these indigenous communities, their parents are, you know, temporarily come and go in the US, so they sort of have also grown up a little bit on this side of the border, and they go back to these communities, and it's like a really interesting hybrid new thing that is happening, and you don't see that in these museums that we're talking about.
I think, I mean, for example, now that I'm seeing Jessica Caire here, in Guatemala, I think that's more present, no? Like people from indigenous backgrounds really inserting themselves into contemporary art production.
Seems that in Mexico, most artists are middle class and very comfortable.
Or in
I don't want to specifically, you know, single out Mexico from the whole Latin American picture, but the artists are creating some interesting spaces there that are, in a sense, kind of complementing to what the museums are not doing or don't have the possibility to do because of all the bureaucracy and the funding and all the infrastructure and whatnot. So like that project that was started by Abraham Cruz Villegas and a group of people on a street, it's called Galería de Comercio, but there's no gallery, it's just it happens to be on the street corner of Comercio and José Martí in la colonia de
Escandón.
So every so often somebody presents a project, you could go to Mexico, or anybody could go to Mexico and submit a project, and you'd be doing it there for one evening, and they have a fantastic network online, and we're not, and it gets to be a real crowd. So you have that too.
I mean, each museum acts in different and in its own ways. And the Tate project was a very specific project, but which created a precedent, especially because they started buying contemporary art. They also, by doing so, they created a bigger market and even raised prices for whoever is collecting today, 10 years later. But they did. I mean, they've done an amazing work in building a collection in the past 10 years or 12 years now, and what they've done is that they've also put whatever they purchase for the collection almost in immediate dialogue with the collection. So whatever gets bought gets shown almost within a year, and in dialogue with other works. So really kind of taking it out of the regional kind of ghetto and stuff. No? So even though there's a department that makes up and concentrates in purchasing from that region, afterwards, once it's in the museum, it's disappeared. I think it was good that Cuauhtemoc was there 6 years. I mean, I think with 3 it was enough. Like he has such a strength and such a power. I think he has his own vision and way of seeing things, and it was good to have other curators afterwards. Julieta Gonzalez, who's sitting here, she did 3 amazing years, and she brought another totally different vision. Now Jose Roca, I mean, I'm not aware of what he has brought into the museum, but I'm sure it's also a different vision. The difference between the Tate project and the Guggenheim, I mean, the Guggenheim, it's a very specific, inserted into another time frame and another context. It's part of a wider project that also approaches South and Southeast Asia and Middle East and North Africa. And the difference is that the curator, in this case myself for Latin America, I was based in New York during this period, and inside the structure of the museum, which the Tate curator is not. The Tate curator works from his hometown where he is and goes to acquisition meetings and doesn't do an exhibition with what he buys. So it's a different method. But for me, what was really interesting is to be inside the kind of the machine of the Guggenheim and really learning how it works. You know, the first day I was there, I was afraid. You know, I was like all these people working like inside madman offices, you know. I went to the photocopy machine and tried to use it, and all these papers went around. I felt like the Latino Dolly Parton in 9 to 5. You know? I mean, hopefully this is the beginning of a further involvement of the Guggenheim with Latin America, even if it doesn't continue with me, but that this is only the start. And other artists, as you said, can be incorporated, and this can be kind of something that goes on. No? So it's not only a one-year project, but the beginning of something.
I think it would make sense if they just continued to have you for a couple of more years.
Me or whoever they
I mean, to
want,
get
no?
used to that whole structure.
And what made it possible to do such a thing was, I mean, to really have all this kind of machine behind, like all these workers that are really dedicated. And